some of the topics that I've covered myself as well. Exactly, you know, the soil testing, the fertilizer, maybe Christian with some different varieties and things to plant in the home garden, that kind of stuff. So I think isn't going to be it is a very basic course, basic introduction, I should say, to the garden planning and a layout of a garden. I'm probably going to try to kind of delve off into maybe a little deeper into each one of these topics, maybe in a future program. But this is just going to be kind of a general overview of the topics. So, you know, and obviously if you have any particular questions, we'll be happy to field those anytime. Feel free to type them in the chat section, and I'll either get to them, I'll check it periodically and answer those as I get them, or if there's something that you'd like to wait at the end, feel free to, we'll have a session at the end where we can unmute everybody and let you ask a question if you feel comfortable doing it that way, would rather do it that way, or you got my contact information, or you will get my contact information at the end, or Christians as well. So if you have any questions, you know, afterwards, feel free to contact us. And as always, thank y'all for being here. And this presentation will be uploaded to his YouTube channel as well in the next few days, as well as the presentation will be available for you to download also for your use or for your record. So getting started, again, thank y'all for being here. My name is Ross Overstreet. I am the extension agent here in Lamar County with Agriculture and Natural Resources Responsibility. Been enjoying being on these presentations with Christian. Appreciate the audience, awesome audience we're having, a lot of questions, a lot of very detailed oriented people that like to, that aren't afraid to ask questions and involved. So always enjoy that. So the first thing we want to think about when we're thinking about a garden, I know this kind of is not a great time as far as garden planning and layout is all that well. You know, typically this is kind of what we're thinking of in the winter time when we're, you know, getting started in the spring, or maybe thinking about getting something started in the spring. But it's never too early to start planning. Maybe start working on a layout and deciding what it is exactly you want to plant, what it is that works well for you and your family, or you know, what kind of fruits or what kind of vegetables, I should say, that y'all enjoy to cook and enjoy eating and would like to be involved in growing. So the most important thing obviously is location. This has, you know, a lot of implications tied to it. A good site basically is easily accessible by you. It's not something that is a chore that you got to walk a mile, park somewhere, you know, cross a couple of fences, get down, walk a mile through the swamp, and finally get to your garden. To it's just going to make it inconvenient for you to get out there and do some work and harvest your crops, you know, and just maintain your garden. So needs to be easily accessible. Obviously, you got to have a fair amount of daylight available, sunlight. At least 6 hours is typical. It's kind of typically what you like to recommend. Obviously, a little bit more than that is good, but obviously it doesn't need the full 12 to, you know, 14, 16 hours that sometimes we can get in the spring. You know, it doesn't have to have pure sunlight all day long. So typically like to see maybe some shade in late evening when the sun's really hot, or when the temperatures get really hot. It wouldn't be a bad idea to have a little bit of that afternoon, evening shade. So also need some type of water supply available. You know, obviously a lot of times irrigation may not be a factor. Like here the past couple of weeks, obviously we have not had to water very much, hardly any. If anything, we would like to take a little water away from just our natural irrigation that we're getting. But something to where you're not having to haul water or haul buckets of water around. That gets old. That's another reason for you to quit and become disinterested in gardening. So having that available water supply nearby makes things convenient. And even, like I said, even installing some type of drip irrigation or subsurface irrigation or drip tape, something like that, misting nozzles, things like that, really makes it more enjoyable because it just takes a little bit of the extra work out of it. So things like that with timers and fertigation systems and things like that obviously are getting a little more complicated. But again, that's to make it easier on you, make it more enjoyable to where you continue to do these things, because the last thing anybody wants is a hobby that isn't very enjoyable. So next thing you need to think about is the correct size. Obviously, all of us would like to have a big garden for the most part. Like, oh, it's just, that's our therapy. Most of us get out and work, play in the dirt and put dirt under our fingernails. And, that's kind of our time to relax. And, obviously, but it does turn into work. So planning enough for you and your planned uses, whether it be canning foods or freezing vegetables or putting up, or you're just wanting enough to go out to the garden and make you a tomato sandwich, a couple of days a week or every day of the week. Planning for these kind of situations and only planning enough will take a lot of that stress and a lot of that work off of you, because you're not planning enough to feed an army per se. You're just planning just the right amount for yourself and for what you have planned for that crop. We do have a great publication called the Garden Tabloid that kind of gives you a rundown of kind of what you can expect to yield from a particular plant, whether it be a squash or a tomato or a cucumber, kind of what those expected yields are, so you can then go out and change or plant that many amount to harvest the amount that you're looking to get. And then we need to think about what we're planting in the soil. Obviously, a loose, fertile, well-drained soil, free from serious weed and disease pressure is ideal. It's not always available. So it's something, that we have to kind of work towards and start thinking of in the future when we start incorporating some compost and some amendments into those areas. Building that soil up over time. It does take a little time, but you'll reap the rewards from it further down the line in future planning. So just planning, obviously you don't want down in the bottom where it holds a lot of water, or water can build up, or apparently the top of a hill may not be the best idea either, because it can dry out too quickly. But again, we have to work with what we got. So sometimes we're not given those options as to where we have to plant. We're kind of stuck with the sites we have. So, and then obviously air circulation. We don't want to box ourselves in with a bunch of tall, big hardwoods or real thick pine stands. We want to try to give it a lot of space to open up to where those plants can get a lot of air circulation in between them. That lessens our disease pressure, allows for more sunlight and more air to get through there, dry those plants out. And then we just have less free water on the plants and availability for the disease pressure. So that just kind of helps out with those instances. So just something to think about. Air circulation, obviously, side of a hill is usually good. Kind of down in the bottom is usually not very well, because that's where cold air can sit, for our fall or winter crops. So you can see a little more frost or freeze damage in those areas. So if you're planting fruit trees, things like that, just be mindful of, you can see some freeze or frost damage by planting in these lower areas where this colder air can settle. So the next thing after we choose our location and kind of putting in those, basically those guidelines that we're looking there for, we want to start preparing that that place or that site for what we plan to use it for, garden. Obviously, I have talked about soil test in a previous presentation. I think that is the best $8 you can possibly spend on your garden or any other agricultural crop, whether it be your lawn, your fruit trees, whatever it is. Flower bed, I think that's one of the best $8 you can spend. It gives you a baseline of where you're at, gives you a recommendation based off of what your exact crop you're growing as to what its needs are and how to supply those needs. So it's just a very good investment, I should say. It's good for 3 years. So if you break it down by that, do one every 3 to 4 years, you're looking at $2 to $3 a year is what it's costing you to do that, which is nothing. So, so once we get our soil test back, we want to make sure we remove any grass from that area, whether it be through the use of a side cutter where we physically remove that grass. A lot of times we can use herbicides in this instance, like glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. Typically, most all of these glyphosate products have a very short replant interval. Can be 1 day all the way up to typically around the most you see is about 14. So, typically we can plant pretty soon after spraying the glyphosate or Roundup product in that area, killing everything out, kind of start fresh in that area. It's a great option. Obviously, it doesn't kill any of the seeds that are in that seed bank, but it does get rid of a lot of that organic matter that we can then incorporate into the soil, use for water holding, or we can go in there, like I said, with a side cutter and strip all that material out, and that will really help get rid of a lot of those seeds if you can get rid of that top 1/4 inch of that soil or that thatch layer where a lot of those seeds can get built up. It's not going to get rid of all of them by any stretch, but it will remove some of them. So then we need to start looking at making sure our soil moisture is correct when we start preparing our soil. Obviously, we don't want to do this when it's super, super dry because the ground's going to be as hard as concrete and you're probably going to mess up your tiller, or you could probably turn it into a powder, which is not a good thing either. It can sometimes, when you till it up and it gets real dry, you'll notice that those real fine, super fine particles, they will settle on the top, they will cake over, and they will basically seal off that ground to where water cannot penetrate. So also don't like to do it when it's super, super wet either, because you will end up with clods or clumps of dirt or soil, which then are very inconducive to growing. You can see in our picture here down at the bottom right, those clods, once they dry, they are tough to get rid of, and it can absolutely destroy your soil structure. So you can see you have a lot of soil. You probably have good drainage right there, but you don't have very good soil moisture holding ability either. So those roots are going to dry out quickly. The plants are going to require a lot of water, and it's just not worth it. So the sidewalk test basically is you just want to go out there, grab a clump of soil with your hand, drop it on the ground, and it's on the sidewalk, and it should shatter pretty easily. It shouldn't bounce up and almost crack the concrete, or it shouldn't just turn, to powder, or it should just kind of, break evenly into smaller pieces. So it's a good way to kind of figure out what works and where the soil moisture is for you in your instance. So at this time, we also need to incorporate any pre-plant fertilizers or any compost we want to add, any of the recommended lime products that our soil test has recommended. Again, pre-plant fertilizer is just that, something that we want to incorporate and have it ready for the plant available immediately when the seed or the transplant gets put into the ground. And then we'll come back and side dress extra fertilizer later on throughout that plant's growing life, so through its life. So we want to make sure we, provide all the nutrients that are missing and get the soil pH correct through the recommended lime. And especially down here in the coastal area, that lime is something that gets kind of neglected, if you want to say. People don't realize how quickly our native soil reverts back to a very acidic soil, and a lot of our vegetables and crops just aren't suited to that. So just something to think about. So once we get our soil, basically our site selected, we get our soil amended and get it prepared, we want to start thinking about the layout of our garden. Obviously the layout is going to be basically with what we have to work with. It's what more or less it's going to be dictated by the orientation of what's available as far as what space is available. So a lot of times a north to south may not be available to us. We may have to run it east and west. Which is not necessarily a bad thing. North to south is typically the best. We typically have a prevailing wind of the south, prevailing wind. So that gives airflow throughout the entire up and down those rows. If we were to orientate it east and west, maybe a south wind is going to hit that first row and be stopped, or that more southerly row that's running east to west, and no longer let air flow in throughout the rest of the garden. But again, that's just something that we don't really have that much control over a lot of times, but we can. But if we can, it's good to do that. So north to south is possible, is best if possible. Again, this allows for maximum air penetration, typically from our prevailing winds. It also allows the best sunlight capturing. So a lot of times if we were to orientate it east to west, some of our eastern side of the layout may get less sunlight than the western side, or vice versa, depending on what crops are planted. So just keep that in mind. We're looking for the best airflow as well as maximum sunlight collecting capacity. So we also need to, when we're laying it out, we need to figure out how are we planning to do any cultivation. Are we going to be using a hoe, or are we going to be doing using a tractor? So incorporating those areas to where you can either, you may need a little more room if you're using a tractor, so you can get around to make your turnarounds at the end of the rows. You may have to make some concessions depending upon which method of cultivation you're planning to use. Obviously, if we're using a hoe, we can go pretty much right up to the property line, or just to the edge of our best ground possible for us to use. As I said, north to south is the best. Otherwise, if that's not available, perpendicular to the slope is best. Not necessarily obviously you don't want to cut a lot of drains and have a lot of ditches running straight downhill. You're going to have a lot of erosion if you try to plant it parallel with that slope. You're going to have water moving, no water holding capacity typically, and you're probably going to see a lot of erosion as that water picks up speed as it's running down those row middles or down those furrows. So also want to plant our taller plants on the west side or on the north side. This may be something that you don't think about, but planting your corn on the east side and planting your smaller crops on the west side is going to block, that corn is going to block later on into the season. That corn will be blocking that early morning sun from those shorter plants that are planted on the west side. So doing it the opposite and planting your taller crops on the west side to where your shorter crops get more sunlight early in the morning, and gather that sunlight, and then maybe get the taller crops like the corn or the peas or the beans that are running beans or pole beans, things like that, may offer some shade to to those shorter crops that are on the east side of your layout. So just some things to kind of be thinking about. Obviously none of this is, set in stone, or none of this is, it's not going to not work if you don't do this, but this will give you a greater chance of success, and probably lead to less issues with disease or sun, shade being an issue. So, things like that are just something to be thinking about. Once we have our layout kind of figured out, we kind of want to start thinking about what we're going to plant. Now this is available. This chart here is available in the garden tabloid. It's basically a rotation and a layout guide. So you can see on the column on the far left, we start with our spring planting, then we progress into our summer planting, which are your May, June, July plantings. And then at the end, we kind of move into our fall plantings in that last crop, or in that last column. And those are our August, September, October typical plantings. So as we do a great job of planting in the fall. We see a lot of good success in fall crops here in our late summer, early fall plantings as that temperature is cooling off. So I really like a fall vegetable garden. I know that's something I think Christian has spoken on before. And I know he's going to talk a little bit at the end of the week about harvesting some fruits and vegetables. So a lot of these that he's going to be harvesting now are going to be your spring plantings and maybe some of your early summer plantings. But again, you kind of see the rotation here, and you'll see down here at the bottom right these related vegetable groups. You have your solanaceae, your tomatoes, your eggplants, your potatoes, your peppers. You have your legumes, your beans, peanuts, peas, cucurbits, cucumber, squash, pumpkin, watermelons. Then you have your leafy greens or your collards or, your lettuces, that sort of thing. So all of these are, I mentioned the related groups because typically those are the ones that you want to rotate through. You don't want to plant these same families in the same spot over and over every year. And you don't want to plant basically same family successively. So, you want to rotate through those crops to where typically our insects and our diseases are more prone on a particular crop, whether it be they may favor a solanaceae crop. So if we can get rid of that solanaceae crop for a year or move it to a different location, that disease is less likely to build up in the soil. Those insects are less likely to build up in high populations. So we're not getting recurring, we're not planting susceptible crops year after year and season after season. We're kind of rotating through those things. You also see on the column on the left where you typically like to see your heavy feeders, which are some of your broccoli or your corn, things like this. You want to follow those to be followed by a legume crop. Our legumes are typically nitrogen producing, so they will put a little bit of nitrogen back into the ground. And when you incorporate those, pull those plants up, when they finish producing, they kind of leave the soil maybe a little bit better than when you started, per se. That's not the greatest way to think of it, but it is an option. It's similar to that. So planting our heavy feeder crops after those requires typically a little bit less fertilizer and leaves the soil not quite as depleted as if you just plant sweet corn year after year after year in the same spot. Or okra is considered a heavy feeder. Broccoli is a heavy feeder, things like that, cauliflower. So that's why you see a lot of these people, they go on this cotton, corn, and soybean rotation, even in our big ag crops. That's the reason that they're doing that, is because they're not letting those pests and disease build up and planting the same susceptible crop every year. And also they're replenishing some of those nutrients lost through a previous crop with a current crop, whether it be a soybeans, putting nitrogen back into the ground, or they're able to use a different herbicide. You know, you're able to use different chemistries based off the susceptible crops. So offers a lot of good things, rotating your crops, planting different vegetable groups, planting, you know, basically you can use this as a guide for rotating through them and planting one crop after the other, and then rotating this every 6th row every year. So the first 6 rows, you may want to plant your corn this year. The next year, you may want to plant the rows 7 through 12 in corn, and then skip everything over 6 rows each year. And then eventually you'll just kind of have that rotation going to where, you know, you're not planting the same thing year after year in the same location. Hope that all kind of makes a little bit of sense. Again, this chart is based off of a 1,000 square foot or a 20 by 50 garden plan. Row 1, it says it's located 12 inches from the edge of the garden, and in each row is 36 inches apart and 20-foot long rows. So that kind of got to give you an idea of what to plant, how much to plant. And again, the garden tabloid is a great resource as far as the varieties to plant. We're not, you know, I don't want to get all deep off into that today, but it can give you some expected yields, some varieties, give you a lot of information as far as plant spacing. I think, again, Christian has covered a lot of this stuff in previous presentations that he has done. So I'm trying to kind of maybe melding a couple of his presentations together today. So this shouldn't be just all brand new material to you. And I'm trying to just try to steal a little bit of Christian's thunder on his horticulture. I'm trying to delve my toes off into that pond or into that water for a presentation. So now again, there are some alternatives to this in-ground planting. A lot of these have been covered as well. I know container gardening and things like that Christian has talked about and spoken about kind of more in depth. So people with maybe smaller areas, or you may not have a suitable area, you may have enough, but you may have 50 acres, but it may 49 of it may be in a swampland or something that's not suitable. So, you know, it's not that you don't have the area, you just don't have a suitable area. So raised beds can be an option. Obviously, you know, these up here in this picture on the top, those are pretty nice. They don't necessarily have to be quite that nice, but typically 4x8 areas are what's recommended. It's easy to get around. You know, it's the right kind of a good size to grow basically any type of crop in. But it allows you to walk around it, less stooping over. You can sit on the side, harvest and work your vegetables or work your crops just a little bit easier. It's going to cost a little bit of money, obviously, for the timbers and just the setup. Obviously, this one probably cost a little more than usual with the rock and, you know, just the nice lumber and just the design. But again, what works for you works. You know, what works for somebody else may not work for you. So getting some ideas and, you know, looking around, seeing what works for other people and kind of melding a few of ideas is typically what I've used in the past. You know, there really I haven't found one source of information or design of layout that has worked great for me on my raised beds. I've taken kind of a little bit from each one and amended those or melded those into that works best for me. Another thing I do a lot of is I use a lot of grow bags. It's very inexpensive for the bags themselves. Where you run into the cost is filling those bags up with potting mix. Again, you don't want to use a heavy native soil in these bags. You don't want to use a potting soil. You want to use a potting mix. You don't want to use any type of just composted manure or anything like that. You know, you can incorporate that into with a potting mix or a seedling mix, but again, it's just a little bit too heavy, a little too not enough drainage for in a grow bag. But again, there are some downsides to these types of alternatives. One of them being, like I mentioned with the raised bed, is could be the cost. The thing with the soil or with the grow bags is going to be the cost of the soil and the amount of water you're going to have to use on these things. You're going to have to keep them watered consistently, judiciously, and constantly. A full-grown tomato plant's going to go through a lot of water, and these things can dry out quickly, so you can run into some issues with drought or with drought stress. Maybe blossom end rot if you're not providing consistent water to a tomato plant. And obviously there are some other options besides just bags, obviously like 5-gallon buckets would be considered a grow bag, or things like that, or planting in the potting soil bag itself, just cutting a slit in the bag and planting straight into it. But again, these are viable options for a garden, can be very, very productive, very easy to work, doesn't require a lot of space. And, you know, I'm a big fan of them, which I have a drip irrigation system on a timer, so I don't really typically have to worry about the irrigation issue. Now, there has been a couple of times where my batteries have gone out while I was out of town, and I come back and I got a bunch of dead plants. But, you know, it happens, but that could happen even with the in-ground planting. Just, you know, it's not something that's just only grow bags or only alternatives are susceptible to, but it's just something to look at. But hay bales are also another great option. I haven't technically had great success with this. It's not, I don't know if it's because I wasn't doing it right, or so I think it's a good option. I think can be rather expensive and rather time consuming, because you do have to condition, or you have to start the breakdown process of these hay bales before you can use them. So you have to use fertilizer, you have to water them, you have to let them go through a heat process to where they're not decomposed or composting and getting real hot and cooking the roots of your vegetables or your plants. So, you know, you just have to check that temperature, make sure it has gone through that heat or through that compost cycle, and has started to cool off, and its temperature has lowered before you start putting any plants in there. So that can take a week or two, or you know, just depending upon the state of the hay bale when you get it. And then also another thing with these hay bales is, you know, if you're using really hay bales, is you have to watch for herbicides or pesticide use. So, you know, planting a tomato plant that is highly susceptible to 2,4-D or herbicide damage into something that was treated with herbicides is really a recipe for disaster. So just something to be aware of. A lot of times wheat straw bales are a better option. They're typically not treated with quite as many pesticides as a forage crop like Bahia grass or Bermuda grass is. So you typically have a little less, you know, you're less likely to run into herbicide or pesticide issues when you're using wheat straw. Not saying that you're not going to, but a little bit less likely to. So again, I know I've mentioned the soil test before, just want to kind of go reiterate that. I've gone through that. There is a presentation strictly on interpreting the soil test results and how to go about collecting a soil sample on the YouTube page. So, you know, if you're interested, I'll be more than happy to help answer any questions specific to that, but I would recommend that you go back and watch that video if you have any questions. Again, like I said, there's best $8 in my opinion you can spend on your garden. It's probably going to save you money in the end by the use of saving you some money on purchasing less fertilizers, because your plants are going to be happier, your plants are going to be less susceptible to disease, healthier. So you're just going to have better results all around. It does give you some soil pH information, gives you You know, really all you're really wanting to pay attention to is what's in the parentheses beside each nutrient, the very high, the low, or the, you don't worry typically about the numbers. Again, it will tell you an approximate pre-plant fertilizer date and rate, as well as any side dress information if the plant needs it. Depending on your crop, it may or may not recommend a side dress treatment. And then at the bottom, though, any kind of comments or extra information that's relevant will be given to you. So it'll tell you apply any lime, and then how often to do the side dressings and with how much, and kind of give you a rundown of what to use. So we've all seen this. Y'all probably, again, I've already done a whole presentation on just nothing but interpreting fertilizer bags and what the numbers mean, how to basically calculate how much of a particular fertilizer it is that you want to use. So I'm not going to go deep into this, but just be aware that what those numbers on that fertilizer bag mean. They are percentages, expressed as percentages. So N, P, and K in that number or in that order. So on this example, you got a 5, 10, 15 fertilizer. So that's a 5% nitrogen, 10% phosphate, and 15% potash based off of the weight of that bag. So that's a 50-pound bag. So, you know, you're looking at 2.5 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of P2O5 or phosphate, and then 12.5 pounds of potash or K2O. So just be aware of that when you're getting it. Not all fertilizers are the same, and know that if you put out one product at the rate of a more nutrient dense product, you can run into some issues like burn and some other things. So just be aware of that. And again, liquid fertilizers, sometimes we can see these mixed up as in tablespoons, and that's all based off of the weight of the product per gallon. So that's not going to be it's calculated just a little bit different. So you kind of need to know the weight of the product. Just some calculation, just some minor calculations. Obviously 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. So we typically just say 43,000 square feet. So when you're doing some computation to figure out the area of your garden, length times width, or, you know, depending on it may change if you're doing a weird, having to use a weird shape, triangle or something like that in your area. You know, depending on what shape garden you're using, it may dictate you need to use a different formula to calculate your area. And basically from this slide, you just need to make sure how to calculate the rate per area based off the analysis of the product. So, you know, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It can be a little confusing, but again, there is a whole presentation on record based off of just nothing but this. So pesticides obviously are very, very, I'd say controversial, can be controversial, but they are highly, you know, they're used a lot, used judiciously and used prudently, basically can help you out tremendously. Again, read the label thoroughly. The label is very much the law. It's not a recommendation. And in the label, you're going to have some application rates and dates, how often, and when to reapply. There'll be a pre-harvest interval, which states that when you apply this product, you must wait so long before you harvest any of the fruit or vegetables off of it. And that label will have that information. It'll tell you any type of personal protective equipment you need to use. And so be sure to read your label thoroughly, follow any of those guidelines for application rates, dates, your reentry period, and your PHI, your pre-harvest interval. With that, I'm gonna kind of wrap up and leave it for questions. Again, I know this was kind of a basic, very basic understanding. And if there's something that you'd like for me to delve a little deeper into in your particular situation or your instance, I'll be happy to field any questions. And I noticed, I'm not sure why, but my computer has started auto-correcting to misstate when my email address should not contain a I in there. So it's RAO12 at msstate, not misstate. But I apologize for that. But you'll see here my contact information. Feel free to email me if you got some questions or some pictures or something that you'd like to have identified. You know, obviously, again, as I always say, you know, would prefer you go through your county agent first, but you know, we're all work together in this. We're all in this together. So, you know, I'll be happy to help any way I can. And typically, we all work together anyway. If I get a question, I'll send it to Christian if it's horticulture related, and I'm not familiar with it, and if it's turf grass related or weeds or something, Christian will forward it to me. So, you know, again, I'd prefer you go through your county agent if you're not from Lamar, but I'll be happy to help any way I can. Give me a call, our website there, and you can find us on social media as well. So I haven't taken a look to see if we have any questions. I am now. Don't see anything. I see Christian has uploaded or posted the link to where you can get the file for today's presentation, as well as the previous presentations, as well as the link to the survey and the link for this coming up Friday's meeting. So that being said, I'm gonna open it up to more questions, whether it be through the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask any questions, we can just talk about it, or we can chat for a minute. I'll be here for the next few minutes. So appreciate everybody being here as always.